For families, New Year's Eve is a time of relaxation, celebration, and gift giving. For the young heroine of this story, it all began the same way. She was only 18 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, and her dreams were beginning to come true. What could possibly mar such a beautiful moment, short of a bloody crime? Nancy Mestre was born in 1975. Her hometown was Barranquilla, located in Colombia. It's a fairly large city with a population of over 1 million. The girl lived with Martin Mestre and Nancy Varga, along with her brother. From childhood, she was always sociable and cheerful. The children had an excellent relationship with their parents. A bond of affection and respect developed between them. Nancy considered her mother her best teacher and her father her best friend. Their family was quite well off. The family's wealth allowed the girl to receive a decent education. She attended one of the country's best colleges, Marymount. Even before she mastered English, she began dreaming of studying in the United States. She was interested in everything connected with this country. She dreamed of living there. On New Year's Eve, 1993, the whole family gathered for a festive evening. They were originally supposed to celebrate the holiday elsewhere, but unforeseen circumstances forced a change of plans. The girl's brother had recently suffered a serious injury in a football match and was unable to continue training for some time. Because of this, he was practically paralyzed, so they decided to celebrate at home. There was another great reason to celebrate. Nancy had been accepted to a U.S. university, and they were celebrating. She would soon be leaving for the United States. Her dream was closer than ever to coming true, but unfortunately, her happy dreams were not destined to come true. Around 1:44 a.m., businessman Jaime Enrique Sana de Carmani arrived at the family's home. The guy was 10 years older than the girl, but that didn't stop him from asking her parents on a date on New Year's Eve. They had been talking and dating for some time beforehand. The guy was from a respectable, decent family, so his parents were very accepting of him. The girl's family didn't refuse him. Nancy also really wanted to celebrate New Year's with his family, but her parents set an important condition. Their daughter had to be home no later than 3 in the morning, and the guy had to take care of her. The couple accepted this condition and went out to have fun. At the appointed time, the young people didn't show up home, but at first this didn't bother the parents. They thought the lovers had simply lost track of time. The family decided not to ruin their daughter's New Year's Eve with restrictions and scandals, simply leaving the stairwell light on for her and going to bed. A few hours later, the head of the family woke up and checked the hallway. Nancy hadn't returned. She wasn't home, and the girl's room was empty, which worried the father. The man first went looking for his daughter at all the popular clubs where she might have been that night. Nancy's cell phone wasn't working, but there was no reason to call the police at that point. The father tried contacting his daughter's friends, but they also didn't know where she was. When his daughter couldn't be found at any of the clubs, the man went to Kaima's house, where he had picked up his daughter and was supposed to bring her home. He assumed his daughter might be there. There, he found his mother cleaning the blood from the floor. It seemed quite alarming. When the father questioned her, she replied that her son and Nancy had gone to the hospital and that the blood on the floor belonged to his daughter. The woman was unable to answer any further questions. She didn't even really know what had happened to Nancy or what condition she was in. The girl's worried father jumped into the car and rushed to the hospital. All this happened around 6 o'clock in the morning. Upon entering the hospital, he encountered Nancy's boyfriend's father, who told him an incredible story. Allegedly, Nancy had attempted to commit suicide that night in their home by shooting herself in the head with a pistol. His father didn't believe the story. This made no sense to the girl's parents. She had never given any reason to doubt her mental health. The young student was cheerful, happy, and more than that. Her dream of attending a U.S. university had just come true. She was looking forward to the trip, and everything was going great for her. She had no reason to be depressed, much less take her own life. He also couldn't believe she would have done it on New Year's Eve while visiting a friend. It simply didn't fit in his head. The man spoke with the nurses who admitted his daughter to the hospital, and they shared some alarming information. They said Nancy had been brought to them completely naked. She was covered only with a sheet and showed virtually no signs of life. There were traces of sand, earth, and some kind of plant on her body and hair, as if she'd been dragged through the forest. None of this sounded like the story Jaime's father had just told him. His daughter was supposed to spend the evening at his family's home and have dinner with them. Why was she naked, covered in dirt and with plants in her hair? Something was clearly wrong. The situation was heartbreaking, and Martin was filled with pain, knowing his daughter's life was hanging by a thread. The man called home and told his wife what had happened. Upon learning this, the victim's entire family immediately rushed to the hospital. However, the doctor's prognosis was grim. Doctors discovered Nancy's injuries were too severe, leading to complications. She fought for her life for 8 days, undergoing multiple surgeries while in a coma. Doctors did everything they could to save her. However, it didn't help. When doctors told the family that their loved one could not be saved, that she would never return to life, and that permission to disconnect her from life support was needed, the family made the difficult decision and consented to have her taken off the machines. On January 9, 1994, they entered her room and began singing a lullaby, saying goodbye to their beloved girl. Nancy died without regaining consciousness, never able to tell her version of what happened that fateful New Year's Eve at Jaime's house. None of Nancy's relatives believed her boyfriend's account, so they went to the police, demanding a thorough investigation into all the circumstances of the incident and asking them to scrutinize Jaime's family, who were clearly hiding something. Law enforcement officials heeded the family's pleas and began an investigation. Forensic tests were conducted, and gunshot residue on Nancy's boyfriend's hands indicated Jaime was lying. The gunshot had been fired into the right temple, but no gunshot residue, consistent with such a method of suicide, was found on the victim's right hand. Instead, traces were found on the left hand. It was obvious to everyone that it was simply impossible to shoot oneself in the right temple in this manner. It would seem that the attacker was attempting to stage a suicide, but the staging was extremely clumsy. An autopsy revealed that the woman had had sexual intercourse with 2 men on the night of the shooting. 2 samples of male fluid were found on her body. Numerous abrasions, bruises, and other injuries on her body indicated active resistance, suggesting she was the victim of a rape that was concealed. Furthermore, medical examiners discovered traces of skin under her nails, which had been broken during the struggle. This is typical of active defense in the event of an attack and allows for the identification of the killer. Skin particles from under the nails were collected and sent to a lab for analysis. Jaime's pistol was found in his home, wrapped in bloody shorts and hidden under the suspect's bed. Ballistics tests confirmed it was the murder weapon. By that point, there was no longer any doubt that it had been a crime, and the case was reclassified as a homicide investigation. Jaime and his family became the prime suspects in this case, as the incident took place in their home, and gunshot residue was found on Jaime's hand. There was every reason to believe that Jaime had raped and murdered the girl, and that his relatives had covered for him and helped him destroy all the evidence, meaning they should also face appropriate charges. It was also necessary to determine who else had raped Nancy that night. Investigators therefore awaited the results of the examination and began gathering evidence to charge them. News of the incident quickly spread throughout Colombia. The public was in an uproar. Several vigils were held in support of the victim's family. People demanded that those responsible for the rape and murder of the young girl, whose life had been so brutally cut short, be found and punished. While the investigation was ongoing, a few days after the events, Martin, the girl's father, received an anonymous letter outlining the probable cause of his daughter's murder. An anonymous source reported that Nancy had caught her boyfriend engaging in perverted sexual activity. Fearing exposure, the perverts caught her, raped her, and then shot her. She was then taken to the hospital, but not immediately, as doctors found traces of soil and plants on her body. This suggested they intended to dump her in the woods, but apparently she still showed signs of life, so the killers decided to take her to the hospital. The identity of the anonymous killer was never established. During the investigation, Jaime disappeared. Apparently, he knew he was about to be arrested and charged, and thus decided to avoid responsibility for his crimes. Detectives tried to find him, or at least contact him, but were unsuccessful. His family claimed they didn't know where he was. The parents couldn't cope with their grief and divorced. Their son went to live in the United States, and Nancy's mother went to live in Spain. Meanwhile, the murdered girl's father, Martin, couldn't sit idly by in the face of such injustice. A retired naval officer with first-hand knowledge of modern technology, he decided to take the search for the fugitive into his own hands. Naturally, he couldn't contact the missing man's family directly for information, so he created 4 social media accounts in an attempt to establish contact. The fake profiles were of 2 men and 2 women of the same Arab ethnicity as the killer's family. Martin gained the family's trust and began monitoring the communications and messages of Haim's relatives. Initially, his knowledge was insufficient, but he studied numerous courses that enabled him to carry out his plan. However, it took 26 years. In his investigations, Martin Mestre discovered that his daughter's killer had a brother living in Brazil, so he focused his attention on that country. But Brazil is such a vast country that it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. It was impossible to determine what city he might be in. At the end of 2019, retired Officer Martin succeeded in what the international search had failed to accomplish. He began to increasingly notice repeated names and titles in the conversations of the family he hated. One of them was Samaria, which looked very similar to Santa Marta, a city located on the coast of Colombia. However, the initial lead proved incorrect. It turned out the word was slightly different, Santa Maria. It was a small town in Brazil, not far from the capital. Nancy's father passed on all the information he had gathered to Interpol. Officers began investigating individuals in the region who might match the fugitive. Thus, they traced Enrique de Santos Abdala, who matched Jaime Enrique Santa de Carmani in every way. He was very similar in appearance, age, and name. International investigators placed him under surveillance to confirm that they were the same person. They were able to obtain a fingerprint from a glass from the cafe used by the man. A test revealed that it matched the fingerprints of the escaped killer. No one doubted that this was Jaime's killer. An operation was conducted jointly with Brazilian police to capture the fugitive. During his arrest on January 29, 2020, he offered no resistance and confessed to being Jaime, but denied killing the girl. The victim's father, Martin, was immediately notified that the criminal had finally been apprehended. It all took just under 3 decades. Martin was so moved by the news that he fell to his knees and wept. Then he called his wife and son, and together they thanked God that justice would finally prevail. But things weren't so simple. According to an Interpol investigation, when the criminal realized he couldn't escape justice, he fled to Brazil with the help of his parents. They also supported him financially throughout this period and helped him create false documents. It turned out he'd settled down well in Brazil. Using fictitious documents, he'd obtained a driver's license, bought a car, opened his own business, and was growing it successfully. He'd also gotten married and had 2 children. Several miscalculations by the criminal were also revealed. For example, he used his real name on his children's birth certificates. Furthermore, prior to his arrest, he had never officially married the woman with whom he had children. However, just a month after the arrest, they officially married. According to the law, this allowed the killer to remain in Brazil and avoid extradition to Colombia. He, of course, knew all this and did it deliberately. The man was being held in a Brazilian prison. Jaime denied his guilt and refused to tell investigators his new version of the story of his death 30 years ago. According to him, Nancy had been using illegal drugs and drinking too much that night, which is why she stayed at their house for so long. The girl didn't want her parents to find her like this and didn't want to go home. To help her recover, the guy suggested she take a shower after sex. She agreed, but a short time later, a gunshot rang out from the room. He went into the bathroom and saw his friend's body, but she still had a faint pulse. After that, Jaime decided to take her to the hospital in the hopes of saving her. He sent this confession by letter while he was in custody under investigation. He noted that Nancy was still alive when he took her to the hospital, and he hoped for her recovery. But he had to travel to Brazil on business. There he received news of her death, which was a huge blow. He then decided not to return when he learned they wanted to arrest him and charge him with her death. But this story didn't explain why gunpowder residue was found on his hands, where she got the gun, or who raped the girl. Also, based on the toxicology. Results. Investigators knew Nancy hadn't consumed anything that night. No alcohol or illegal substances were found in her system. Therefore, his story sounded implausible. Later, the detainee's testimony changed again, thanks to the criminal's lawyer. He stated that Jaime had been in Colombia until the girl's last day. He hoped she would come to her senses and tell the true story of events, confirming his innocence. But when she died, all hope was simply dashed. He knew there was no way he could prove his innocence. Therefore, the man was forced to flee to Brazil to avoid becoming the victim of a miscarriage of justice. But even this story didn't explain the presence of gunpowder on Jaime's hands. His DNA was found under the victim's fingernails and on her body after the rape. Therefore, this story also seemed untenable. Discrepancies between the defendant and his lawyer were also used in court as evidence of his guilt. The fugitive's wife was not shocked that the man with whom she had spent 20 years turned out to be a dangerous criminal wanted internationally. She knew he was involved in this unpleasant affair. After a year of dating, he told her everything and convinced her of his innocence. She believed him and repeatedly spoke in her husband's defense, including on Brazilian television. She was allowed to speak, but her words weren't taken seriously. It seemed she was under the influence of a lie and simply didn't want to believe that her husband was a bloodthirsty murderer and rapist. She claimed that throughout their marriage, he had never laid a finger on her or the children. The woman completely ignored the authorities' assurances that her husband should have gone to Colombia to prove his innocence, if that was indeed the case. It seemed like extradition was only a matter of time. But the statute of limitations for the crime under Brazilian law had already expired. He was sentenced to 20 years, and his arrest took place 26 years later. Therefore, the authorities refused to extradite him to Colombia. His father tried to appeal this. For this reason, the case was referred to the Supreme Court, which was to make a final decision. The vote was divided, and it was decided to keep the criminal in Brazil. Furthermore, 57-year-old Jaime was released to return to his family and children. The only charge he faced was forgery. This came as a real shock to the murdered girl's family. It seemed as if all the father's incredible work, thanks to which the killer was found, had been in vain. But the retired officer wasn't used to giving in. He knew Jaime and someone else had raped his daughter. They'd abused her and then killed her. He had to seek justice for his daughter. So Nancy's relatives and friends hired lawyers from the United States who specialize in international cases. They also filed several petitions to Brazil to have the case reviewed. And this finally worked. A decision was made to extradite the dangerous criminal to Colombia and retry him. On April 18, 2023, Jaime Enrique Sando de Carmane was finally extradited. The man, as before, was accused of raping and murdering Nancy Mestre, who was barely 18 at the time. Police took the fugitive into custody, but his family again managed to secure his release on bail. He immediately fled again, but never made it out of the country. He was discovered and arrested on May 1, 2023. The victim's relatives now await a fair trial and punishment for the brutal criminal. The second rapist remains unidentified. But Nancy's family hopes that Jaime will turn in his accomplice during the trial, and he too will be punished. Jaime's family has also not been charged with any complicity or concealment of evidence. Share your thoughts in the comments, and like this story if you found it interesting. And don't forget the bell. Thanks for watching.